Against the deep indigo of a pre-dawn sky, the great lighthouse stands as a man-made mountain of white stone. It is a tower of almost impossible scale, a monument to commerce and control that dwarfs the natural cliffs it rises from. The Mediterranean Sea, restless and grey, boils around its massive foundations. Waves, driven by an unseen wind, crash against the cyclopean masonry, sending plumes of white spray hundreds of feet into the air, drenching the lower tiers of the colossal structure. At the very peak, more than 400 feet above the turbulent water, a single point of orange light flickers against the fading stars. Beside it, silhouetted by the immense flame, a tiny figure moves with deliberate purpose. The sheer scale of the tower against this lone human form underscores a profound isolation. For this keeper, the weight of an empire's maritime trade rests upon the simple, repetitive and lonely duties performed in the hours between dusk and dawn. The life of this keeper is dictated by a vast and complex system of maritime navigation. Below, beyond the horizon, hundreds of vessels depend on this single point of light. These are the grain ships, the lifeblood of the great city, sailing the treacherous routes from the fertile plains of Egypt. For their captains, the lighthouse is not a monument but a promise, the sole guarantor of safe passage into the protected harbour of Alexandria. This entire network of trade is built upon the simple principle of line of sight. The keeper's fire on a clear night can be seen from nearly 30 miles away. It is the final, indispensable link in a long logistical chain that connects farmers in a distant province to the bakers and citizens of the metropolis. Without it, ships risk being wrecked on coastal shoals or lost in the disorienting darkness, their precious cargo sinking into the sea. To understand the keeper's daily challenges, one must first understand the lighthouse itself. The structure is not a simple tower but a complex, tiered machine for living and working. From the distant perspective of a ship at sea, it appears as a single, elegant column. But to truly grasp the keeper's world, we must move from the outside in, beginning an ascent from its wave-battered base to the lantern chamber at its apex. The journey begins inside the massive square base, a fortress in its own right. This lowest tier contains barracks for a small garrison of soldiers, cavernous storerooms, and administrative offices. The air here is cool and still, thick with the smell of damp stone, salt, and the faint, dry scent of stored grain. This is the ground floor of the keeper's world, a place of logistics and security far removed from the fire above. From these lower chambers, the keeper begins the first major task of the day, the ascent. There are no narrow, winding stairs here. Instead, a vast internal ramp, wide enough for 2 fully laden carts to pass, spirals gently upwards through the core of the structure. This ramp is a critical piece of architectural engineering, designed not for people, but for the relentless daily transport of fuel. It is this constant need for fuel that defines the keeper's routine. The light at the top of the tower is not an eternal flame or a trick of mirrors alone. It is a colossal, hungry fire that must be fed. The entire beacon mechanism is a system designed to convert raw materials, tons of dried wood or vast quantities of oil, into a single, powerful beam of light projected out to sea. The heart of this system consists of 2 primary components. The first is the fire itself, held within a massive iron brazier. The second, and more technologically impressive, is the reflector. Behind the fire sits a massive curved sheet of highly polished bronze, perhaps 15 feet in diameter. This mirror, a marvel of ancient metallurgy and optics, is what transforms a simple bonfire into a navigational instrument of immense power. As the first light of dawn appears on the eastern horizon, the keeper's true work begins. The transition from the relative stillness of the night watch to the physical labor of daytime maintenance is immediate. The moment the horizon is clear enough for sailors to navigate by landmarks, the great flame is carefully extinguished and the chamber is prepared for the coming night. The first and most grueling task is to clean the fire pit. With a cloth wrapped around their face to ward off the choking dust, the keeper begins to shovel out the remains of the night's fire. Hundreds of pounds of hot ash, cinders, and unburnt fuel fragments must be removed from the iron brazier and hauled away. It is hot, filthy, and suffocating work performed in the confines of the lantern chamber. The ash is heavy and dense, and each shovelful must be carefully deposited into thick leather buckets. The heat radiating from the brazier is still intense, even hours after the main flame has been put out. The air fills with a fine grey powder that coats every surface, including the keeper's skin and clothes, and stings the eyes. This process is not merely about cleanliness, it is essential for the proper functioning of the beacon. If the old ash is not completely cleared, it will clog the air vents at the base of the brazier. This blockage restricts airflow to the next night's fire, causing it to burn inefficiently and with less intensity. A dimmer flame could fail to reach the ships that are farthest out, directly endangering their crews and cargo. The lives of unseen sailors depend on this thorough, exhausting, and solitary morning task. Once the brazier is clean, the next relentless task begins, resupplying the fuel. For a fire large enough to be seen for miles, the consumption of wood or coal is immense. The keeper must now begin the arduous process of hauling the night's fuel supply up the hundreds of spiraling steps. This isn't a single trip, but a grueling series of ascents and descents, each one a test of strength and endurance. The fuel, whether it's dried timber, pitch-soaked logs, or baskets of coal, is stored at the base of the tower. The keeper loads a heavy sack or a wooden carrier onto their back, the rough material digging into their shoulders. The climb is made in semi-darkness, the only light filtering from the narrow slit windows that punctuate the stone walls. The air is cool and damp, a stark contrast to the heat and ash of the lantern room above. Each step is a familiar agony. The keeper's leg muscles burn, their breath comes in ragged gasps, and the weight on their back feels like an anchor pulling them down. This is not a task that gets easier with time. It is a daily punishing struggle against gravity and exhaustion. The sheer volume of fuel required is a constant physical reminder of the immense responsibility that awaits them when darkness falls. There is a profound monotony to this part of the day. The rhythmic thud of feet on stone, the creak of the carrier, the rasp of their own breathing. It becomes a kind of bleak meditation. The view from the slit windows, a sliver of sea and sky, offers little comfort. It only serves to emphasize their isolation and the vast, indifferent expanse they are charged with illuminating. With the fuel for the coming night finally stacked and ready in the lantern chamber, the keeper can turn their attention to the second most critical component of the lighthouse, its ability to project the light. The fire itself is only half of the system. The other half is the surface that captures and reflects its glow, sending it out across the water. In these ancient structures, there are no complex glass lenses. Instead, the beacon is backed by a massive curved reflector. This is most often a wall of highly polished stone, like marble. or a large shield of painstakingly smoothed bronze. Over the course of the night, this surface has become coated with a fine layer of soot and grime from the open fire. Cleaning this reflector is a delicate and meticulous art. The keeper uses soft cloths, often made of well-worn linen or wool, and a polishing agent. This might be a fine abrasive like powdered pumice or a paste made from ash and oil. They work in small circular motions, carefully lifting the black film without scratching the precious surface beneath. The work is slow and requires intense focus. Every square inch of the reflector must be returned to a mirror-like sheen. A single missed spot or a smear of soot can create a dark patch in the projected beam, a blind spot that could hide a deadly reef from a ship's watch. The keeper often has to contort their body, reaching high or crouching low to polish every part of the concave surface. The tools are simple but essential. Buckets of fresh water hauled up from the cistern below, the soft cloths, the polishing paste, and perhaps a scraper made of bone or wood for any stubborn deposits of resin. The keeper's hands, already calloused from hauling fuel and shoveling ash, become stained with the black residue of the fire, a testament to their intimate connection with the flame. The consequence of a poorly polished reflector is a severely diminished light. The brilliant, concentrated beam that sailors rely on would become a dull, diffuse glow, easily lost against the horizon or mistaken for a star. It would rob the lighthouse of its reach, shrinking its protective circle and leaving vessels in the outer sea lanes dangerously vulnerable. This task, like the cleaning of the brazier, is a direct link between the keeper's effort and a sailor's life. A moment of carelessness or a shortcut taken due to fatigue could be the difference between a safe passage and a shipwreck. The brilliant gleam that returns to the polished surface is not just a reflection of the sky, but a reflection of the keeper's own diligence and dedication. By the time the sun is high in the sky, the most physically demanding parts of the morning are complete. The brazier is clean, the fuel is stocked, and the reflector shines with a blinding brilliance. The lantern room, once a chamber of smoke and shadow, is now a pristine space, ready for the coming night. But the keeper's work is far from over. The great tower itself still requires their constant vigilance. With the heart of the lighthouse now prepared, the keeper's attention turns to its body. They begin a slow, methodical descent down the winding staircase, their hands and eyes scanning the stone walls. They search for the subtle signs of wear and tear, a new crack in the mortar, moisture seeping through a joint, or the telltale dust of crumbling stone. A storm's lashing waves or the constant assault of wind and salt could compromise the tower's integrity. To neglect this inspection would be to risk the entire structure, turning the beacon of safety into a tomb. The inspection continues outside, at the very base of the tower, where the sea gnaws relentlessly at the foundation. The keeper checks the breakwaters and surrounding rock, ensuring the ground beneath them remains solid. Once satisfied, the focus shifts to personal and operational logistics. They take stock of their own provisions, water, oil, grain, and salted fish, calculating how long their supplies will last until the next relief boat. Every resource is finite, and survival depends on meticulous planning. This inventory is as critical as trimming the wick. A starving keeper cannot tend a flame. With the brazier now clean and cold, the keeper turns to the lighthouse's most crucial optical component, the great reflector. This immense curved sheet of polished bronze, tarnished by a night of smoke and heat, must be restored to a perfect mirror. It is a task of patience and precision, essential for projecting the fire's light across the sea. For the next 2 hours, the keeper works with a simple but effective mixture of fine sand and oil. Using soft cloths, they meticulously polish the entire surface, working in slow, overlapping circles. The physical effort is considerable, but the goal is absolute flawlessness, removing every last trace of soot and haze until the metal gleams like the sun itself. This technology, while seemingly rudimentary, was a marvel of ancient physics. The reflector was not merely a flat mirror, but a carefully shaped parabola. This specific curve was calculated to capture the scattered, chaotic light of the open fire and gather it into a single, concentrated beam. This process of collimation was the secret to the lighthouse's power. It transformed a simple bonfire visible for only a few miles into a piercing ray of light that could be seen dozens of miles out at sea. The reflector was the instrument that turned a landmark into a true navigational aid, the heart of the entire system. The daily polishing becomes a solitary, meditative ritual. The rhythmic motion of hand on metal, the quiet focus in the sunlit lantern room, and the gradual emergence of a brilliant shine create a space for contemplation, a rare moment of peace in a life of strenuous duty. As the keeper works, a distorted, elongated reflection of their own face stares back from the vast bronze curve. It is a daily confrontation with their own image, a silent reminder of their singular, irreplaceable role as the human cog in this colossal machine of stone and light. With the lantern chamber finally pristine and ready for the coming night, the keeper's attention shifts to the most physically demanding part of the daily routine. The focus moves from cleaning and polishing to the relentless necessity of resupplying fuel for the great fire. The lighthouse is a voracious beast, consuming an immense quantity of wood or oil to burn through a single 12-hour night. The logistics of feeding this fire are a daily, monumental undertaking, requiring a coordinated effort between the keeper above and a team of workers far below. At the base of the tower, a team of oxen or a dozen men lean into the heavy wooden arms of a massive capstan. With agonizing slowness, they turn the great winch which pulls on a thick rope running up a central shaft that pierces the very core of the structure. Attached to this rope are heavy nets laden with fuel. The payload, often weighing hundreds of pounds, begins its slow swaying ascent through the darkness of the tower's interior, rising 400 feet from the storerooms at the base to the lantern level at the peak. The keeper, positioned at the top of the shaft, is the final link in this chain. They operate the heavy wooden trapdoors that open to receive the cargo, their timing and communication with the team below critical to the smooth operation of the hoist. Each morning requires more than 20 of these individual lifts. The keeper must guide each net safely onto the lantern deck, unload it, and signal for the next. This process is repeated until 2 tons of dried, seasoned wood are stockpiled, enough for a single night's burn. The wood is then carefully stacked in designated storage bays within the lantern chamber. It must be arranged to allow for air circulation, keeping it dry and ready for combustion, while also ensuring it does not obstruct the keeper's movements during the long night watch ahead. The entire fuel hoist system is fraught with peril. A single frayed rope, a moment of inattention from the keeper, or a mechanical failure in the capstan could have catastrophic consequences. The constant tension on the ropes and wooden gears creates a persistent risk of failure. A snapped line would send a payload of wood plummeting down the central shaft, smashing the hoisting mechanism to splinters. Such an accident would not only be dangerous but would effectively darken the lighthouse for weeks, leaving sailors without their guide and representing a total failure of the keeper's duty. But the keeper's duties are not confined to the tower's interior. Around midday, their work takes them outside, onto a narrow, wind-whipped walkway that encircles the tower 450 feet above the churning sea. Here, exposed to the elements, they conduct a methodical inspection of the exterior masonry. They search for new cracks in the massive stone blocks, damage from the last storm, or the subtle signs of weakness caused by earthquakes or the simple passage of time. The keeper moves along the precarious ledge, examining the lead seals that join the limestone blocks together. Where the mortar has crumbled, they apply fresh mixture from a pouch at their waist, patching the giant's skin against the corrosive salt spray. They carry a small hammer, which they use to test the integrity of the stone itself. Tapping gently, they listen for the sound. A solid ring means the block is sound, but a dull, hollow thud suggests internal decay, a hidden danger that must be marked for later repair. This task requires an extraordinary degree of courage. High on the exposed face of the tower, the keeper is a tiny, solitary figure battling vertigo and the ceaseless push of the wind. Their life depends entirely on a few precarious handholds and their own steady nerve. The scale is immense, the individual is small. They are a living custodian to a body of stone, a single person responsible for the integrity of a structure that stands against the full power of the ocean. It is a profound and humbling responsibility. After the morning's intense physical labor, both inside and out, the afternoon brings a different kind of duty. The keeper's role shifts from one of maintenance to one of vigilance. Their watch is not just for the night, they are the eyes of the port during the day. From this high vantage point, the keeper is the first to see anything that approaches from over the horizon. The lighthouse is more than a beacon. It is a watchtower, a critical component of the city's awareness and defense. From the highest observation deck, the keeper scans the sea with a sighting tube, a simple bronze cylinder used to focus the eye on distant objects. They methodically sweep the horizon, identifying approaching fleets, noting their number, their flags, and their likely origin. Their watch is for any anomaly on the vast, empty expanse of water. They look for the telltale signs of pirate activity, the low-slung ships that prey on merchant routes, or the more tragic sight of a ship in distress, damaged, adrift, or sinking far from shore. Any report of such a sighting is immediately dispatched to the harbour master via a system of signals, perhaps a specific flag or a polished shield used to flash a message with the sun's rays. This information is vital, giving the city precious time to prepare its defences or send out a rescue vessel. The keeper is not just a tender of the light, but a sentinel, the first line of a sophisticated communication network linking the city to the sea. But the afternoon is not solely for watching. The great tower itself is in a constant slow-motion battle with the elements, and it requires unending care. The sea is a relentless adversary. Its salt-laced spray coats the stone, eating away at the mortar. The wind scours the surface, and the sheer force of storm waves can threaten the very foundations of the structure. The keeper's duties must therefore include the preservation of their colossal charge. This means regular, perilous inspections of the exterior. The keeper must check for weaknesses in the masonry, for stones loosened by the constant vibration of the waves, and for the insidious creep of erosion. They learn to read the language of the stone, to spot the fine hairline cracks that could, over time, become catastrophic failures. It is a slow, methodical, and often nerve-wracking process. When a weakness is found, it must be repaired. This could involve mixing a fresh batch of mortar and applying it to the joints, a task performed while suspended hundreds of feet in the air on a simple wooden platform, held by ropes that groan and strain in the wind. Dangling over the churning, unforgiving sea, the keeper becomes a stonemason, clinging to the side of the tower that is both their home and their greatest responsibility. The fight against decay continues inside. The damp, salty air permeates everything, threatening to rot wooden beams and corrode metal fittings. The keeper must constantly check for leaks, for moisture seeping through the thick stone walls. They inspect the integrity of the long spiral staircase, the condition of the ropes and pulleys used to haul fuel and supplies, and the security of the great bronze mirrors and lenses that form the heart of the beacon. This constant cycle of maintenance instills a profound sense of ownership, but also a persistent, low-level anxiety. The keeper's own survival, and the survival of countless sailors, depends on the structural integrity of the tower. Every storm that batters the coast is a test, and the keeper lies awake listening to the shriek of the wind, feeling the vibrations through the stone, and praying that their repairs will hold. A deep, almost familial bond develops between the keeper and the lighthouse. They know its every secret, the way the stone groans in a gale, the echo of footsteps on a particular stair, the pattern of light and shadow that moves across the interior walls with the passing of the sun. It is less a building and more a living companion, a silent, steadfast partner in their solitary existence. As the afternoon light begins to soften and the sun angles towards the western horizon, the keeper's focus shifts once more. The time for maintenance and observation draws to a close, and the preparations for the coming night must begin. The most crucial part of their daily ritual is now at hand, the rekindling of the great fire. The final, arduous ascent of the day begins. More fuel must be brought to the summit, whether it is bundles of resinous wood, sacks of coal, or heavy amphorae of oil. It all must be hauled up the seemingly endless staircase. This is a task that drains the last reserves of a keeper's physical strength, a necessary expenditure of energy to arm the lighthouse against the encroaching darkness. At the very top, in the lantern room, the keeper makes the final preparations. The fire basin is cleared of the previous night's ash and soot. The polished bronze reflectors are given a final wipe, ensuring their surface is perfect and unblemished. Every detail is attended to with a practiced, ritualistic precision, a final act of devotion before surrendering the world to the night and the singular guiding power of the flame. As the last sliver of the sun dips below the far horizon, the moment arrives. With a practiced strike of flint against steel, a shower of sparks dances in the dimming light. One catches, breathing life into a small bundle of tinder. The keeper carefully nurtures this nascent flame, feeding it with small dry pieces of wood until it grows strong enough to consume the larger logs or ignite the oil-soaked wicks. The fire roars to life, a sudden blossoming flower of orange and yellow in the glass-enclosed summit. It licks at the air, casting long flickering shadows that writhe against the curved walls. The polished bronze mirrors catch the light and hurl it outwards, a single powerful beam slicing through the deepening twilight to begin its silent, sweeping watch over the sea. The day's labour is complete. The night's vigil has begun. From the highest gallery of the lighthouse, the keeper spends the long afternoon hours in a state of constant, sweeping observation. Their eyes, accustomed to the immense distances, trace the line where the sea meets the sky. They search for the telltale glint of a distant sail, the dark speck of a hull, or the unnatural pattern of oars from a pirate galley trying to use the coastline for cover. This visual information is not kept to oneself. It is a vital part of the harbour's intelligence network. Using a system of brightly coloured signal flags hoisted on a mast, the keeper communicates the number, type and direction of approaching ships to the port authorities below. On clear, sunny days, a polished bronze shield can be used as a heliograph, flashing coded messages across the water with brilliant bursts of reflected light. The lighthouse is not merely a beacon for the night. By day, it is the port's primary watchtower and communications hub. The consequences of a lapse in this duty are severe. A single missed signal could mean that the harbour is unprepared for the arrival of a large merchant fleet, leading to collisions and chaos as ships vie for anchorage. An even greater danger is the failure to spot a fast-moving pirate vessel. Such an oversight could allow raiders to fall upon unsuspecting cargo ships, resulting in the loss of goods, vessels, and lives, all because the eyes in the tower were not sharp enough. As the sun arcs across the sky, the long, quiet hours of the afternoon begin to weigh on the keeper. This is a time for introspection, where the mind can wander. The endless expanse of blue water and white clouds can be a source of immense tranquility, a meditative state unavailable to those in the crowded cities. But this same vastness can also become a mirror for a profound and crushing loneliness, a sense of being the only person left in the world. The keeper's world is confined to the stone cylinder of the tower. Their living quarters, perhaps on the second or third tier, are Spartan. A simple rope bed, a small wooden table, a single chair, and a chest for personal belongings make up the entirety of their domestic space. There is no conversation, no music, no sounds of the city. The only companions are the constant low moan of the wind around the stone and the distant lonely cries of gulls. The psychological toll of such profound isolation is immense. The silence can become an adversary, a void that the mind desperately tries to fill. Keepers might find themselves speaking aloud, narrating their own actions simply to hear the sound of a human voice, even if it is their own. Others might invent imaginary companions or fall into periods of deep, unshakable melancholy, where the routine of survival feels meaningless. These are not mere flights of fancy, but active, necessary procedures for mental survival. The keeper might develop a ritual of talking to the seabirds that land on the gallery, giving them names and imagining conversations. They might spend hours carving small figures from driftwood or singing old songs into the wind, the sound immediately snatched away by the gales. These are the routines that keep the mind anchored, preventing it from drifting into despair. Maintaining this mental fortitude is as essential as any physical task. A keeper who succumbs to madness or despair is a keeper who might neglect the flame. The consequence is not just a personal tragedy, but a systemic failure. A dark lighthouse is a direct threat to maritime safety. and so the keeper's psychological resilience is, in effect, a crucial component of the entire navigational system. The keeper's very survival, both mental and physical, depends on a fragile but essential link to the shore. The tower, for all its strength, is an island, and its inhabitant cannot last long without support. This lifeline is the supply chain, a system as vital to the lighthouse's operation as the fuel for its fire or the polish for its mirrors. This system is centered on a dedicated supply barge, which, weather permitting, makes the journey from the port once a week. It carries the fundamental necessities of life: barrels of fresh water, sacks of grain, salted fish, and amphorae of oil for the smaller lamps that light the keeper's quarters. To receive these goods, the keeper lowers a large woven basket on a rope and pulley, carefully hoisting the precious cargo up the sheer face of the tower. Upon its arrival, every item is meticulously inventoried. The keeper must be a careful steward of these resources, as a sudden storm could delay the next delivery for weeks or even a month. Rations are carefully managed, with each day's portion measured out to ensure the supply lasts. Water is the most critical resource of all, decanted immediately into a sealed cistern built into the tower's foundation to protect it from contamination and evaporation. Mismanaging these supplies is a fatal error. A keeper who consumes their rations too quickly faces starvation. A contaminated water cistern could lead to sickness and incapacitation, leaving no one to tend the beacon. In such a scenario, the port is rendered blind, and the failure of this simple provisioning system could lead to disaster at sea, a direct consequence of a breakdown in the administrative oversight of the lighthouse. Late in the afternoon, the keeper notices a change. The sky to the west, which should be clear, is taking on a dark, bruised color. The wind, which has been steady all day, begins to shift direction and pick up strength, carrying a new, damp chill. The seabirds, usually soaring high above, are now flying low over the waves, seeking shelter on the leeward side of the island. These are the telltale signs of an approaching storm. There is no time to waste. The keeper must act quickly, following a well-practiced routine to secure the tower against the coming onslaught. All external wooden shutters are closed and barred. The hoist and crane used for supplies are checked, their ropes secured and coiled to prevent them from flailing in the wind. On the observation deck, any loose materials, a spare coil of rope, a wooden bucket, are double lashed to the railings. A sense of focused dread fills the keeper, mixed with a surge of adrenaline. They have an unshakable faith in the colossal stone tower, knowing its deep foundations and massive walls were built to withstand the worst the sea can offer. Yet they also know the terrifying raw power of a storm at this height, the violence of the wind that can tear stone from mortar, and the sound of waves that can shake the very bedrock on which their world is built. The entire existence of the lighthouse and its keeper is dependent on a meticulously planned yet fragile supply chain. This lifeline is typically a single designated boat from the nearest port, tasked with bringing everything needed for survival and operation. This includes not just personal provisions like salted meat, dried beans, and grain, but the very lifeblood of the light itself: barrels of olive oil or tallow, spare wicks, polishing cloths, and tools for maintaining the complex machinery of the lantern. The keeper's life is a constant exercise in resource management, balancing the rate of consumption against the next scheduled arrival. This resupply is not a casual affair. It is a critical logistical event, often scheduled for specific weeks of the year when the sea is most likely to be calm. The keeper's internal clock is set by these dates. A missed supply run is not a simple delay. It is a fundamental break in the contract of survival, triggering an immediate and stressful period of conservation. Every action, from the size of a meal to the brightness of the flame, must be re-evaluated. The isolation, already profound, deepens with the knowledge that the connection to the outside world has been severed, even if only temporarily. Long before the supply ship is expected, the keeper engages in a formal process of inventory and requisition. A careful record is kept of every measure of oil burned and every ration consumed. Based on this ledger, a list of needs is compiled. Goods cannot simply be carried up the winding stairs. A crane or a pulley system anchored to the gallery at the top of the tower is used to hoist heavy barrels and sacks from the deck of the bobbing ship below. The keeper and the boat's crew must work in perfect coordination, timing each lift with the swell of the waves. A moment's miscalculation could send a precious barrel of oil crashing against the rocks or, worse, injure one of the men involved in the delicate operation. Should this vital link be broken by a prolonged storm, an outbreak of plague in the port, or even bureaucratic neglect, the keeper enters a state of heightened alert. The first step is immediate and strict rationing. The great flame in the lantern, the very reason for their existence, may be carefully reduced in size to conserve fuel, a calculated risk that shortens its visible range. Personal food stores are stretched, with meals becoming smaller and less frequent. Every task is re-examined through the lens of conservation. If the delay persists, the situation grows desperate. The keeper is forced to make impossible calculations, weighing their own survival against their duty to the mariners who depend on the light. The psychological strain is immense. The loneliness of the post becomes a terrifying vulnerability. Every passing sail on the horizon brings a surge of hope, and everyone that continues on its way without stopping is a fresh wave of despair, reinforcing the feeling of being utterly forgotten. As the storm finally breaks, the world outside the tower dissolves into a maelstrom of wind and water. The air itself seems to turn solid, a battering force that screams and howls around the stone structure. Rain is driven horizontally with such ferocity that it penetrates deep into the ancient mortar, causing the inside walls to weep with moisture. The rhythmic crash of waves gives way to a constant, chaotic roar. Below, the sea is a churning fury. Waves, monstrous and grey, rise up and hurl themselves against the lighthouse's foundation. Each impact is a physical blow that shudders through the entire tower, a deep, resonant boom that feels as if the very rock on which it is built might crack. The sound is an all-consuming thunder, a violent symphony of nature's rage that obliterates silence and makes thought itself difficult. The keeper's focus narrows to the lantern room, a small circle of order amidst the chaos. The primary enemy now is the wind. It attacks the ventilation system, threatening to starve the flame of air, or worse, to send a powerful gust down the shaft to extinguish it completely. The keeper must constantly monitor and adjust the cowls and vents, a delicate and nerve-wracking dance to keep the fire breathing steadily. Salt spray, atomized by the wind and carried hundreds of feet into the air, becomes a constant enemy. It coats the thick glass panes of the lantern, creating a translucent film that dims the beam and renders it less effective. In a terrifying display of duty, the keeper may be forced to clip a safety line to the gallery railing and step out into the teeth of the gale. Buffeted by the wind and drenched in freezing spray, they must meticulously wipe the glass clean, ensuring the light shines with its maximum possible brilliance. of the gale, leaning hard into the wind to scrub the salt film from the outer glass. Each pane is a battle, a desperate effort to preserve the clarity of the beacon for the ships that might be fighting this very storm. As dusk settles, the storm's initial violence begins to wane, replaced by a deep, resonant wind and driving rain. The keeper retreats from the gallery into the relative quiet of the lantern room. The air is cold and damp, but the most important work of the day is about to begin. The transition from day watch to night watch is the most critical moment in the lighthouse's daily cycle. This ritual is the singular purpose of the keeper's isolated existence. No matter the weather, no matter their state of health or mind, the flame must be lit. It is an absolute, unbreakable duty. With practiced efficiency, the keeper prepares the large, open brazier that serves as the beacon's heart. A base of dry tinder and shaved kindling is laid down first. Then, seasoned logs, split and dried for months in the tower's lower levels, are stacked in a careful lattice to ensure air can circulate freely. The keeper then takes up a bow drill, spinning a wooden spindle against a fireboard until a small glowing ember is born from the friction. This delicate spark is carefully transferred to the tinder. A gentle breath, a wisp of smoke, and then the first yellow tendrils of flame curl upwards. In that moment, as the fire takes hold, the keeper feels the immense weight of their responsibility. The small flame they have just created is now the most important fire for 100 miles in any direction. On its steady light depend the lives of sailors, the fortunes of merchants, and the strategic security of the port. This fire is a solemn promise, a beacon of order and safety projected into the chaos of the natural world. Its light is a declaration that even on the darkest nights the harbour is open and civilization stands watch. Maintaining this fire through the night is a demanding science. It is not enough for the flame to simply burn. It must burn with a consistent, predictable intensity. The keeper must act as the fire's lungs, constantly managing the flow of air through a series of adjustable vents and flues. Too little air, and the fire will smoulder, producing more smoke than light. Too much, and it will roar through its fuel supply, threatening to die out before dawn. The keeper's experience dictates every small adjustment, a constant balancing act between brightness and endurance. The night watch settles into a long, repeating cycle. Every half an hour the keeper must feed the fire, heaving heavy logs into the brazier. The blast of heat is intense, searing the skin and making the air difficult to breathe. Immediately after, they must use a long iron poker to stoke the embers, breaking up any accumulated ash and ensuring the core of the fire burns hot and even. This routine is physically draining, a repetitive series of tasks that must be performed without fail until the sun rises. A lapse in this routine has severe consequences. If the fire is not stoked properly, it can begin to burn inefficiently, producing a thick, oily smoke. This dark smoke carries particles of soot and resin that drift upwards and backwards, slowly coating the polished bronze mirror behind the flame. The mirror, designed to gather and project the light, gradually becomes dull and ineffective. The beacon's range is slowly choked off, a degradation of power invisible from the tower itself. This insidious failure, a slow dimming rather than a sudden darkness, is a keeper's greatest fear, for it gives ships a false sense of security, luring them toward a coast they believe is still miles away. As if to test the keeper's resolve, the storm, which had briefly calmed, returns with renewed violence after nightfall. Rain lashes against the lantern glass with the force of thrown stones. The wind howls around the top of the tower, a constant, shrieking assault that seems to want to tear the very lantern from its stone base. The entire structure groans under the pressure, a low, constant vibration that travels through the keeper's body, a reminder of the immense forces at play. The keeper is now an isolated figure at the epicenter of a natural war. The sound is overwhelming, a physical pressure on the eardrums that makes it hard to think. Waves, far larger than before, explode against the tower's foundation, sending shudders all the way to the top. It is a display of nature's raw power that inspires both terror and a profound sense of awe, reinforcing the keeper's own smallness in the face of the vast, indifferent sea. The storm turns the keeper's methodical routine into a frantic vigil. Their most urgent task is now to check the seals of the lantern room. They move from one massive window pane to the next, running their hands along the leaded joints, feeling for any trace of moisture. A single leak could spell disaster. If a splash of cold seawater were to find its way inside and strike the superheated surface of the bronze mirror, the metal would crack instantly from thermal shock, shattering the lighthouse's optical heart and extinguishing all hope for those at sea. Out on that same storm-tossed water, the captain of a merchant vessel strains his eyes against the blackness. His ship is being driven toward the coast, and without a landmark, he is sailing blind. In this maelstrom, the distant lighthouse is his only point of reference, his only hope of finding the safe channel into the harbour. Its absence means certain destruction on the hidden reefs that guard the approach. Then, through a momentary break in the driving rain, he sees it. A tiny, steady pinprick of light, impossibly distant yet unwavering. A collective sigh of relief passes through the exhausted crew on deck. It is their lifeline. The sight of the beam, however faint, is enough. The captain can now plot a course, turning the ship's bow toward the light with renewed confidence. In that moment, he and his crew feel a profound, unspoken gratitude for the unknown keeper who maintains their link to the living world. This single light projects the power and reliability of the city far beyond its walls. It allows maritime trade, the lifeblood of the ancient economy, to continue even when the sea is in its most foul temper, transforming a chaotic frontier into a managed corridor of civilization. Back in the lantern room, the keeper is a solitary figure silhouetted against the colossal blaze. The night is his domain. Below, the world sleeps, but up here, the universe is awake and alive. He hears the constant low moan of the wind as it wraps around the stone tower, a sound that has become as familiar as his own breathing. He sees the constellations wheeling slowly across the sky, their cold, distant light a stark contrast to the living, hungry fire he tends. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below is the heartbeat of his world. It is a sound of immense power, a constant reminder of the forces he stands against. From his perch, the sea is a vast, unknowable darkness, a liquid desert stretching to the edge of the world. His light is the only star that matters to the men who navigate that emptiness, a man-made sun in a world of water and night. When the weather turns, the familiar sounds of the night transform into a symphony of chaos. The gentle moan of the wind becomes a high-pitched shriek, a scream that seems to tear at the very stones of the tower. The keeper feels the structure vibrate with each powerful gust, a deep tremor that runs from the foundation right up to his feet in the lantern room. It is a terrifying, humbling experience, a reminder of his own fragility in the face of nature's raw power. Fear is a constant companion during these storms, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. But it is a fear that must be mastered. He cannot afford to be paralyzed by it. The lives of unseen, unknown sailors depend on his courage and his steady hand. He pushes the fear down, channeling it into a heightened state of alertness, his senses sharpened by the adrenaline and the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. His duties become frantic and precise. He must ensure the heavy storm shutters over the lantern room's windows are securely barred, protecting the precious glass from flying debris or the sheer force of the wind. He double-checks the vents that allow smoke to escape, ensuring they are clear but not allowing driving rain to enter and threaten the fire. Every creak of the tower, every whistle of wind through a crack is a problem to be investigated and solved. Water is the enemy. It finds its way through the tiniest gaps in the mortar, running in cold rivulets down the interior walls. He moves about the upper levels with buckets and rags, mopping up the ingress, preventing pools from forming that could weaken the structure or make the spiral stairs treacherous. His most critical task is protecting the fire itself. A single wave crashing over the top, a single breach in the lantern's defenses, could extinguish the flame and doom any ship within sight. The failure of the light is not an abstract concept, it is a tangible catastrophe. If his fire dies, the guiding star for the entire region vanishes. A ship, already battling the storm, would lose its only fixed point of reference. The captain, believing he is heading for a safe channel, might instead be sailing directly toward a submerged reef or a treacherous headland, completely blind to the danger until the sickening crunch of timber on rock. The consequences would be swift and brutal. The ship would be torn apart by the waves in minutes. Its precious cargo, grain, wine, pottery, metals, would be lost to the depths. But far more devastating would be the loss of life. Sailors, merchants, and passengers who had placed their faith in that distant light would be consumed by the cold, violent sea. The news would eventually reach the port, a story of tragedy that began with a single extinguished flame. This knowledge is the keeper's heaviest burden. It is a weight he carries with him through every moment of his watch. He doesn't know the names or faces of the people on those ships, but he feels an intense, personal responsibility for their safety. Each log he adds to the fire, each time he polishes the reflectors, he is performing an act of profound service, a sacred duty to strangers he will never meet. In the quiet moments between tasks, he might stare out into the blackness and imagine them, a tired crew hauling on ropes, a merchant worrying over his goods, a family huddled below deck. They are out there, trusting him. This thought is both a source of immense pressure and a wellspring of purpose. His isolated, repetitive life is given extraordinary meaning by the simple fact that others depend on it to continue their own. The light is more than just a beacon, it is a tool of precise navigation. Its consistent presence and known location allow a skilled navigator to take a bearing. By observing the light's position relative to the stars, or by taking multiple sightings as the ship moves, a captain can calculate his own position with remarkable accuracy. The lighthouse transforms a featureless coastline into a readable map, allowing for a safe and calculated approach rather than a desperate gamble. This knowledge is the keeper's heaviest burden. It is a weight he carries with him through every moment of his watch. He doesn't know the names or faces of the people on those ships, but he feels an intense, personal responsibility for their safety. Each log he adds to the fire, each time he polishes the reflectors, he is performing an act of profound service, a sacred duty to strangers he will never meet. In the quiet moments between tasks, he might stare out into the blackness and imagine them, a tired crew hauling on ropes, a merchant worrying over his goods, a family huddled below deck. They are out there, trusting him. This thought is both a source of immense pressure and a wellspring of purpose. His isolated, repetitive life is given extraordinary meaning by the simple fact that others depend on it to continue their own. The light is more than just a beacon, it is a tool of precise navigation. Its consistent presence and known location allow a skilled navigator to take a bearing. By observing the light's position relative to the stars, or by taking multiple sightings as the ship moves, a captain can calculate his own position with remarkable accuracy. The lighthouse transformed raw observation into mathematical certainty, a cornerstone of reliable long-distance trade. While the lighthouse itself is a monument of engineering, its function is entirely dependent on the steady hand of its keeper. This role, often imagined as one of pure solitude, was rarely a one-man operation, especially at the great beacons that guarded the ancient world's most important harbours. The immense scale of a structure like the Pharos necessitated not a single hermit, but a small, dedicated society. This was a specialized community, a network of individuals bound by a shared critical duty, living and working apart from the bustling city they protected. At the heart of this community was a clear structure. A chief keeper, likely a man of considerable experience and authority, would oversee the entire operation. Under him, several assistant keepers would share the burden of the watches, ensuring the light never failed. Below them, apprentices learned the trade, performing the more laborious tasks of hauling fuel and cleaning, hoping one day to earn a watch of their own. This team operated in shifts, a rhythm of duty that mitigated the intense psychological pressure of the role and ensured that a fresh, alert mind was always attending the flame. The transition between these shifts was not a casual affair but a formal, almost ritualistic procedure. The keeper ending his watch would provide a detailed report to his replacement, a verbal log of the tower's life over the preceding hours. This briefing covered the precise state of the fire, the rate of fuel consumption, and any changes in the prevailing winds or sea conditions. It would also include notes on any notable ships sighted, their type, heading, and time of passage, information that could be vital for the port authorities below. This shared responsibility forged a unique and powerful bond. In the close confines of the tower, miles from shore or high above a city, these men relied on each other completely. The safety of mariners, the integrity of the lighthouse, and their own lives depended on the diligence and competence of their colleagues. It was a small, self-contained brotherhood, defined by a purpose that few outsiders could truly understand. They shared the same risks, the same routines, and the same profound sense of duty, creating a trust that was absolute and unspoken. But not all lighthouses were colossal structures like the Pharos. Far more common were the smaller beacons, perched on remote windswept islets or desolate headlands. Here, the community of keepers vanished, replaced by a much more intense and demanding form of solitude. In such a place, the keeper's world shrank to the dimensions of the tower itself. It might be nothing more than 3 small, circular stone rooms stacked one upon the other, with the lantern at its peak. This was his entire universe, a vertical island surrounded by an indifferent sea. The solitary keeper shouldered every burden alone. The back-breaking work of hauling fuel up the winding stairs, the meticulous polishing of the reflectors, the constant wearying vigilance of the night watch, all fell to him. There was no one to share the load or check his work. His day was a fragmented cycle of duty and brief respite. A 12-hour watch through the night was followed by a day of maintenance and preparation. Sleep was not a long, unbroken rest, but was stolen in short 2-hour bursts whenever the essential tasks were complete. For this lone sentinel, the greatest and most constant fear was not the sea or the storm, but the fallibility of his own body. In such profound isolation, a simple illness or a minor injury could escalate into a catastrophe. A sudden fever, a debilitating sickness, or a fall on the stone steps resulting in a broken leg was a potential death sentence. There was no one to tend to his needs, no one to take over his duties, and often no way to signal for help until the next supply boat arrived weeks or even months later. The final consequence was not just personal. An incapacitated keeper meant an untended light. The great flame, the very reason for his existence, would falter, sputter and die, leaving the coastline dark and treacherous. The beacon's failure would be the only message sent to the outside world that something was terribly wrong. Given the immense responsibility and the harsh conditions of their work, the question of the lighthouse keeper's place in society naturally arises. Were they seen as mere labourers, or did their vital role afford them a measure of respect within the complex hierarchies of the ancient world? Their position was unique. They were not soldiers, priests, or high-ranking bureaucrats, yet the economic lifeblood of the state depended on their nightly vigil. Understanding their social standing requires looking past the isolation and examining their connection to the administrative powers that built and maintained the great beacons. A keeper was far more than an unskilled watchman. He was a skilled technician. He needed a practical understanding of combustion, optics, and basic meteorology. This level of technical expertise separated him from the vast pool of manual labourers. Consequently, they were almost certainly state employees, operating under the authority of the port or a naval administration. This would have entitled them to a regular salary, provisions, and possibly even a pension upon retirement, hallmarks of a stable, respected, middle-status profession. Yet, for all their importance, they were profoundly invisible. They lived and worked at the very edge of society, their faces unknown to the thousands who relied upon them. Sailors arriving in port would praise the magnificent lighthouse, a gift from the king or the gods. Merchants would celebrate the safety of the harbour that allowed their goods to arrive intact. But the keeper himself, the man whose tired eyes and calloused hands made it all possible, remained an anonymous, solitary figure. His daily struggles and unwavering dedication went unseen and unsung by the very world he served to protect. The arrival of winter brought with it a new set of challenges, particularly concerning the logistics of fuel. The cold, damp air of the season was a constant enemy of the fire. The keeper's duties shifted to a new kind of vigilance, the battle against moisture. Wood, the most common fuel, had to be kept perfectly dry to ensure a clean, bright burn. This was a difficult task in a stone tower constantly assailed by sea spray and rain. The keeper would have to meticulously manage his stockpile, rotating the logs in the lower storage rooms daily to promote air circulation and prevent the onset of rot or damp. Some of the more advanced or well-funded lighthouses may have supplemented wood with other fuels. Oil, likely olive or a cheaper fish oil, or even early forms of mined coal, offered greater energy density and a longer burn time, reducing the sheer volume of material that needed to be hoisted. These alternatives, however, demanded their own specialized systems. Oil would be stored in large, sealed amphorae to prevent spillage and contamination, requiring a different feeding mechanism for the lamp. Coal would produce more soot and require different tending techniques and more frequent cleaning of the reflectors to maintain their brilliance. The keepers' social standing was as unique and isolated as their post. They were not a common labourer, yet they were far from the elite. In the eyes of the state, they were a crucial functionary, a civil servant entrusted with a vital piece of infrastructure. To the sailors who depended on their light, they were an unseen, almost mythical guardian. This official status afforded them a measure of respect, but it was a distant and impersonal kind. They were a living symbol of safety and order, yet rarely a participant in the community they served. When they did venture into the nearby port for supplies or a rare period of leave, they would have been a curiosity. Children might point, and townsfolk might speak to them with a mixture of awe and pity for their solitary existence. They were men who lived on the edge of the world, whose daily companions were the wind and the waves, not other people. This set them apart, creating an invisible barrier that casual conversation could rarely breach. They belonged to the tower, and the tower belonged to the sea. This strange social position undoubtedly had a profound emotional impact. The keeper might feel a deep sense of pride and purpose, knowing that countless lives and fortunes depended on their diligence. Yet this pride would be mingled with an inescapable loneliness. The respect they received was for the office, not the individual. They were the keeper of the light, a title that overshadowed their personal identity, making them feel more like a component of the lighthouse than its master. This duality could foster a stoic, almost philosophical temperament. Detached from the daily dramas of the town, the keeper's world was one of elemental forces and immense responsibility. Their connection was not to the sailors they saved, but to the abstract principle of safe passage. The constant crushing weight of their duty, the knowledge that a single night of failure could spell disaster, would forge a personality of extreme discipline and self-reliance, a soul weathered by solitude as much as the tower was by the sea. The logistics of moving this vital fuel from the base of the tower to the lantern room was a daily feat of engineering and brute strength. The primary mechanism would have been a system of ropes and pulleys, perhaps anchored to a simple wooden crane or a capstan on the lantern level. Day after day, the keeper would haul heavy baskets of wood or coal or carefully secured jars of oil up the central shaft of the tower. It was exhausting, repetitive, and dangerous work in a cramped, often dimly lit space. This process required careful planning. Fuel was likely hoisted to an intermediate storage level before being brought in smaller quantities to the very top. This prevented the lantern room from becoming dangerously cluttered and reduced the number of trips needed during the night watch. The keeper had to be a master of efficiency, calculating the night's needs with precision, ensuring enough fuel was ready without creating unnecessary hazards. This relentless cycle of hauling and stacking was as fundamental to their duty as the light itself. Ultimately, this entire fuel supply chain was a testament to the organizational power of the ancient state. The keeper did not forage for their own wood. The delivery of fuel was a scheduled, state-managed operation, a critical artery connecting the isolated outpost to the heart of its civilization. The consequences of a single miscalculation were severe. Allowing the wood stores to become damp, for instance, was a critical error. Green or wet wood would produce a thick, acrid smoke that could obscure the mirror and choke the keeper, but more dangerously, it created a sputtering, unreliable flame. Such a weak flame was vulnerable to the powerful gusts of wind that could find their way into even the most well-designed lantern room, especially during winter gales. A light that flickered, or worse, went out entirely, was the ultimate failure. The keeper's foresight in managing the quality and dryness of the fuel supply was therefore just as important as managing its quantity. These small, repetitive tasks, the hauling of fuel, the careful tending of the fire, the cleaning of the mirror, were the foundation of a vast economic system. The keeper's daily isolated routine was directly connected to the prosperity and stability of an entire empire, a link forged by the sea lanes the lighthouse made safe. The great lighthouse was more than a navigational aid. It was an economic engine. By providing a reliable beacon, structures like the Pharos enabled something revolutionary for the ancient world: large-scale, year-round maritime trade. This consistency fundamentally altered the patterns of commerce and supply. For Rome, this meant the vital grain shipments from the fertile lands of Egypt could continue through the milder winter months. Previously, the sailing season largely closed down in winter, creating scarcity and price volatility. The lighthouse extended the season, ensuring a steady flow of food to the capital's ever-growing population. A single week of the great light being extinguished could have catastrophic effects. Hundreds of tons of grain, wine, and other goods would be delayed as ships were forced to anchor in treacherous waters or wait in distant ports, their captains unwilling to risk the final approach to the harbour without the guiding light. This delay would ripple through the supply chain. Merchants in Alexandria would face financial ruin as their cargo spoiled or missed its market window. In the capital, officials would have to manage dwindling stockpiles, knowing that every day the lighthouse remained dark brought them closer to a crisis. The economic shock would quickly become a political one. As grain reserves ran low in Rome, the price of bread would skyrocket, leading to hoarding and public anger. The threat of riots over food shortages was a constant fear for Roman emperors, and a dark lighthouse could be the spark that ignited the city. The keeper, in their stone tower, unknowingly held a key to imperial stability. Beyond its practical function, the lighthouse was a profound statement of power. During the day, its colossal form, clad in white marble, was visible for miles across the blue Mediterranean. It was a landmark long before its light was needed, a brilliant white spear on the horizon. This structure was a deliberate symbol of the wealth, technological supremacy, and maritime dominance of the kingdom that built it. For the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Pharaohs was as much a monument to their dynasty as it was a service to sailors, a declaration of their command over the natural world. For a merchant or a traveller seeing it for the first time, the approach to the harbour must have been an experience of overwhelming awe. The tower seemed to rise from the sea itself, an impossibly large and perfect structure that dwarfed everything around it. It was an icon of civilization's triumph over the chaotic and dangerous sea. This was a feeling the keeper, living within its walls, knew in a more intimate and complex way. They were not just an observer of this triumph, but the agent responsible for enacting it night after night in a constant struggle against the very forces the tower was built to defy. But these complex systems, operated by a lone individual, were vulnerable. The fusion of human diligence and ancient technology was a fragile one, and its failure was a keeper's most profound nightmare. When things went wrong, they went wrong catastrophically and often with no immediate solution. The most terrifying scenario was a failure of the primary optical system. Imagine a severe winter storm where the tower is battered by winds and the lantern room shudders. A structural weakness, a sudden impact from debris, or simply thermal stress could cause the great bronze mirror to crack. In an instant, the lighthouse's power would be gone. The perfectly focused, miles-long beam would dissolve into a diffuse, weak glow with little directional force. The effective range of the beacon might plummet from over 30 miles to less than 5, offering little more guidance than a simple bonfire. The keeper would be forced to initiate emergency procedures. Unable to repair the mirror, their only option would be to compensate with raw fire. They would have to build a much larger, less efficient blaze, consuming fuel at an alarming rate simply to generate enough ambient light to be seen a few miles out. At the first light of dawn, the keeper's next task would be to communicate the disaster. They would ascend to the top of the tower and hoist a specific sequence of signal flags, a pre-arranged code understood by the port authority, signaling critical equipment failure and the urgent need for assistance. The repair of such a component was a monumental undertaking far beyond the scope of the keeper. A new mirror, or at least large replacement sections, would need to be cast in the city's most skilled foundries. This was a process that could take months of painstaking work by master metalsmiths. Transporting the massive polished bronze plates would be a logistical challenge in itself. They would be carefully loaded onto special barges, moved to the island, and then begin the slow, arduous journey up the tower's internal ramps, hauled by teams of labourers. The final assembly, hundreds of feet in the air, would be a task for specialised artisans sent from the capital. They would painstakingly piece the segments together, polishing the seams and calibrating the precise curvature needed to once again project a powerful, focused beam out to sea. For the keeper, this entire period represented a profound and public failure. Though not their fault, the weakness of their light was their responsibility. They had to continue their nightly duties, tending a crippled beacon they knew was inadequate for the task. Each night they would light the fire and stare out into the darkness, haunted by the knowledge that ships were navigating with a false sense of security. The fear that a vessel, relying on their diminished light, might founder on the rocks was a heavy burden to carry, a personal torment that would last until the tower's full glory was finally restored. The keeper's personal torment was a microcosm of a much larger crisis. A failure of this magnitude transcended the daily routines of maintenance and fuel supply. It was a systemic breakdown, a fracture in the very infrastructure that supported the lighthouse's existence. The operator, isolated at their post, was not just a tender of the flame, but the last, most visible link in a long and complex chain of administration, engineering, and supply. When that chain broke, they were the one left holding the frayed end. The problem was no longer about hauling more wood or polishing a surface. It was about metallurgy, state finance, and political will. The keeper could send frantic messages via supply ships, but their pleas were just the first step in a slow-moving bureaucratic process. The decision to repair the Great Mirror was not theirs to make. It would be debated in administrative halls far from the sea, by men who might not fully grasp the urgency felt by a mariner navigating a treacherous coastline in the dark. The consequences of this delay rippled outward from the tower. Imperial grain ships, vital for feeding the capital's populace, would have to navigate with greater caution, slowing their approach and risking spoilage or shipwreck. Naval patrols, which relied on the lighthouse as a fixed navigational point for coastal defense, were suddenly operating with a diminished strategic advantage. The lighthouse was not merely a convenience, it was a cornerstone of maritime commerce and military power. Its compromised state was a blow to the city's prestige. The Faroes was a symbol of technological supremacy and civic pride, a declaration of the kingdom's mastery over the sea. A weak or absent light was a public admission of vulnerability, a sign that the great machine was fallible. Visiting merchants and foreign dignitaries would see the diminished beacon and whisper of decline, a narrative no ruler wished to encourage. In the city, the keeper's report would set in motion a cumbersome procedural response. Scribes would document the incident, creating official scrolls that would be passed from one office to another. A commission of architects and engineers would be assembled, tasked with undertaking the dangerous journey up the tower to assess the damage firsthand. Their own report would then be submitted to the Treasury, which would deliberate on the immense cost of the project. Every step was fraught with potential delay. A key official might be traveling, a budget might be strained by a recent military campaign, or the master artisan needed for the casting might be engaged on another state project. The keeper, meanwhile, could only wait for news, their isolation amplifying their sense of powerlessness. They were entirely dependent on a system that was now working against the very purpose of their existence. This situation exposed the inherent fragility of such advanced infrastructure. The system was designed for predictable, routine upkeep, the regular delivery of fuel, food, and lamp oil. It had protocols for replacing ropes, sharpening tools, and patching masonry. It was an operational machine built for constancy, not for catastrophic, unprecedented failure. There was no spare great mirror sitting in a warehouse. The specialized skills required for the repair were themselves a vulnerability. The knowledge of how to cast, transport, and install such enormous curved sections of bronze was not common. It was a closely guarded craft, passed down through a small number of guilds or families. If the master smith had recently died or if their workshop was unavailable, the entire project could be stalled indefinitely, waiting for the right expertise to become available. The very ambition that made the Faroes a wonder of the world also made it susceptible to this kind of crippling event. A simpler beacon, a mere bonfire on a headland, could be restored with local labor and common materials. Every supply crew, every visiting official, every fisherman who shouted a question from his boat was a reminder of the tower's inadequacy. They were forced to inhabit a monument to impotence, a giant structure that proclaimed a power it could no longer project. The silence from the capital was more deafening than any storm. Each passing day without word of progress deepened the keeper's anxiety. They continued their duties mechanically, the familiar rituals of lighting the fire and watching the horizon now hollow and meaningless. The pride they once took in their work had curdled into a quiet shame, a constant nagging fear that the system they served had forgotten them and the vital light they were meant to protect. But the memory of routine operations was a stark contrast to this paralysis. The resupply of fuel was not a matter of men carrying sacks up endless stairs, but a feat of industrial engineering. At the tower's base, within a cavernous, stone-walled chamber, a team of oxen plodded in a circle, their power turning a massive wooden capstan. This was the engine that fed the light. When a supply ship docked, the ground crew would load a huge rope net with timber or heavy amphorae of oil. The keeper, positioned at the uppermost service level, would hear the shouts from below. At his signal, the oxen would strain, and the great rope would begin to groan as it coiled around the capstan's drum. The payload would rise into the tower's central shaft. From his high vantage point, the keeper operated a series of levers that opened and closed heavy oak trapdoors on each floor, clearing a path for the ascending cargo. It was a slow, vertical dance of mechanics and shouted commands echoing up the shaft. This system, while efficient, was fraught with peril. A moment of miscommunication could send the payload smashing into a closed trapdoor. Worse, a frayed rope snapping under the immense load would be catastrophic. Tons of material would plummet down the tower's core, obliterating stairways, shattering floors, and turning the structure's interior into a cascade of deadly debris. This reliance on a complex, dangerous machine underscored the keeper's place not as a solitary hermit, but as a vital component in a much larger state-run operation. The isolation of a failing beacon was profound, but a keeper was never truly alone. He was the final, most distant link in a complex chain of command, a state-run institution that stretched from the capital's marble halls to his wind-swept perch above the sea. The light's power was a direct reflection of the state's power, and its maintenance was an administrative, not just a personal responsibility. This institutional support was managed by a designated official, perhaps the harbour master or a specific magistrate for maritime affairs. This office held the authority to hire and fire keepers, to arrange for the procurement and delivery of fuel, and to manage the payroll that sustained the men and their families. When major repairs were needed, it was this bureaucracy that commissioned the engineers, sourced the materials, and approved the colossal expenditures. To maintain this connection, keepers were required to submit regular reports. These records, perhaps inscribed on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, would be sent with the supply ships. They detailed fuel consumption against the number of hours lit, noted unusual weather patterns, and logged any significant sightings or incidents. Over years, these meticulous logs created an invaluable operational history for the administration, allowing them to anticipate needs and identify long-term problems. This bureaucratic system was a double-edged sword. A competent and well-funded administration was a lifeline, ensuring that fuel, food, and repair crews arrived on schedule. But a corrupt or inefficient one could be a death sentence for a remote post. A delayed fuel shipment could mean a dark tower for weeks, while ignored requests for mortar or timber could allow minor structural damage to fester into a catastrophic failure. On a clear, calm night, the anxieties of administration faded into the background. From the lantern room, the keeper could see the distant lights of the city, a silent, glittering carpet spread across the horizon. The ceaseless noise of Alexandria, the markets, the harbours, the chariot-filled streets, was completely lost to the wind and waves. Only its glow remained, a constant, luminous presence across the dark water. This nightly vista created a profound sense of both connection and detachment. The keeper was the unsleeping guardian of that distant, sleeping metropolis, a vital component of its economic life, yet he was utterly removed from it. He watched over a world he could not join, his existence defined by the paradox of being essential yet separate, a solitary sentinel for a society he could only observe from afar. Ancient accounts of the great lighthouses sometimes strayed into the realm of legend, claiming the central mirror could be angled to focus sunlight and burn enemy ships on the horizon. While likely an exaggeration, such stories point to a sophisticated understanding of optics. The ability to project a single flame's light for dozens of miles was a monumental achievement of science and engineering. The keeper's duties therefore extended beyond simple fire tending to the maintenance of these advanced optical systems. The primary reflector, a massive curved sheet of polished bronze or silver, required constant care. Every day it had to be meticulously cleaned and polished to prevent tarnishing from the salt air and soot from the fire, ensuring maximum reflectivity. Any degradation of its surface would directly diminish the power and range of the beacon. Beyond the immediate team stationed at the tower, keepers were part of a wider, unspoken community, a tradition of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The skills required to operate a structure as complex as the pharaohs were not learned from books. They were ingrained through years of direct experience, ensuring the light would not fail when its original builders were long gone. The role of keeper was a craft typically passed down through a formal or informal apprenticeship. A young man, perhaps the son or nephew of a current keeper, might begin his service as a labourer at the tower's base. His initial duties would be grueling and simple, turning the capstans for the fuel hoists, carrying water and mixing mortar for minor repairs. This apprenticeship could last a decade or more. Slowly, the novice would learn the tower's secrets. He learned to read the subtle shifts in wind and clouds that foretold a coming storm, to identify the sails of different merchant fleets, and to understand the unique groans and vibrations of the tower under stress. Most importantly, he absorbed the dozens of unwritten techniques for managing the Great Fire, how to stack the wood for a slow, even burn, and how to adjust for different qualities of fuel. This system created a living lineage of knowledge, a sacred trust passed from master to apprentice. The senior keeper was not merely a supervisor but a mentor responsible for shaping his successor. He was entrusting the safety of thousands of sailors and the prosperity of the port to the hands and mind he had personally trained, ensuring the flame would be tended with the same care and expertise long after he was gone. Even with the fire burning perfectly and the bureaucracy cooperating, the tower faced a more insidious threat. Another daily challenge was the endless effort to combat nature's attempts to reclaim the structure. Flocks of gulls and other seabirds constantly sought to nest in the crevices of the masonry, their acidic droppings slowly but surely eating away at the mortar that held the massive stone blocks together. Part of the daily routine, therefore, was a perilous and unpleasant one. Junior keepers, secured by crude ropes, would have to abseil down the sheer faces of the tower, scraping away the corrosive guano and dislodging the stubborn nests. It was a constant Sisyphean task. As the moment a section was cleaned, the birds would begin to return. Failure to keep up with this dirty work meant allowing the very glue of their fortress to dissolve into dust. Beyond the exterior stone, the heart of the tower's function required a different kind of meticulous care. The Great Fire itself was only half of the system. To truly project its warning across the vast darkness, the light had to be captured, focused, and aimed. This was the work of the reflectors, the most precious and technologically advanced equipment in the entire structure. These were not glass mirrors as we know them today, but massive curved plates of highly polished bronze or silver. Arranged in a precise arc behind the fire, they formed a colossal concave mirror. Their purpose was to catch every possible stray flicker of light that would otherwise be wasted, illuminating the interior of the lantern room, and to bounce it back out to sea in a single, powerful, concentrated beam. Every single day, without fail, these reflectors had to be polished. This was not a casual wipe down, but an hours-long, painstaking process. Using the finest abrasives available, perhaps powdered pumice, ash, or the soft bone of a cuttlefish, the keepers would rub the metal surfaces until they gleamed with a flawless, liquid-like sheen. Any speck of soot, any hint of tarnish from the salt-heavy air would diminish the light's power and reduce its range. The keepers understood the simple but profound physics at play. They were masters of practical optics, knowing that the precise curve of the plates and the perfection of their surface were all that stood between a life-saving beacon and a mere bonfire. A single fingerprint or a dull spot could create a flaw in the beam, a dark patch on the sea where a ship might founder. Their daily polishing was a direct act of saving lives, performed with the focus of a surgeon. This intricate, demanding work was not performed by a solitary figure. The ancient lighthouse was a world unto itself, a vertical village inhabited by a small, dedicated team. The immense isolation of their post, often miles from shore on a wave-battered rock, necessitated a self-contained and highly structured community. These men were not just colleagues, they were fellow citizens of a tiny, stone-bound nation. Life in the tower was governed by a rigid hierarchy and an unwritten code of conduct. At the top was the head keeper, a veteran who held ultimate authority over the light and the lives of his crew. Beneath him were one or two deputy keepers, experienced men who could manage the flame in his absence, and at the bottom were the apprentices, learning the trade through years of hard labour. Every man had his domain and his duties, from the precise trimming of the wicks to the careful rationing of food and fresh water. The schedule was relentless, dictated not by the sun but by the flame. Shifts were organized in watches, ensuring that at no point, day or night, was the lantern room left unattended. The tower was a living machine, and they were its dedicated, sleepless components. This strict organization was born of absolute necessity. These keepers were utterly dependent on one another for their survival. A man who fell ill needed to be tended by his comrades. A man who grew lazy or careless endangered everyone. Trust was the most valuable commodity in the tower, and it had to be earned and maintained every single day. There was no room for feuds or insubordination when your life depended on the man working the next watch. The infrequent arrival of a supply ship was the most significant event in their calendar. It brought not only fuel, food, and letters from a world they barely saw, but also a brief connection to humanity. The head keeper was responsible for meticulously inventorying every cask of oil and sack of grain. He would then ration these essentials to last until the next unpredictable arrival, a task requiring foresight and iron discipline. A miscalculation could mean starvation or the failure of the light. In such a confined and high-stakes environment, personal conflicts were inevitable, yet they could not be allowed to fester. The head keeper served as the ultimate arbiter of any dispute. His judgment was final, his authority absolute. Justice was swift and practical, designed to restore working order as quickly as possible, lest a personal grudge compromise the tower's sacred mission. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. The constant, thunderous roar of the sea, the shrieking of the wind, the profound isolation, and the crushing weight of responsibility could wear a man's spirit down to a nub. Some keepers were driven to madness by the solitude, hearing phantom voices in the wind or becoming obsessed with the hypnotic dance of the flame. Yet, for those who could endure it, the tower forged a unique and powerful camaraderie. These men shared a bond deeper than friendship, forged in shared hardship and a profound sense of purpose. They were a brotherhood of light, standing together against the eternal darkness and the fury of the sea. They understood, in a way no land dweller ever could, the vital importance of their shared vigil. This communal duty extended from the lantern at the tower's peak to the foundations at its base. The very structure they inhabited was under constant assault, not just from birds but from the most powerful and relentless force of all, the ocean itself. Every storm was a battle, and every day brought a new struggle to maintain the integrity of their stone sanctuary against the waves. After a violent gale, the keepers would descend to the base, their hands tracing the lines of the stonework, searching for cracks, spider-webbing through the massive blocks or gaps where the relentless salt water had scoured away the mortar. Salt was a patient and insidious enemy, crystallizing in crevices, prying stones apart with slow, inexorable force and coating every metal surface with a corrosive patina. Repairs were a constant, grueling task. Mixing fresh mortar, packing it into the joints and replacing corroded iron fixtures was a daily act of defiance against the ocean's ceaseless attempts to reclaim the very rock upon which they stood. The slow, grinding work of repointing mortar and sealing cracks was a constant, but the tower faced more immediate threats as well. The very life that thrived around the isolated structure was a source of endless maintenance. Every morning, the keepers contended with the vast seabird colonies that viewed the lighthouse as their own cliffside roost. Part of the day's first duties involved a full inspection of the exterior, clearing nests from drainage scuppers, window ledges, and the narrow walkways of the observation decks. The keepers might use loud clappers or polished metal discs to scare the birds away. On more prestigious towers, a trained hawk was sometimes kept, its mere presence a potent deterrent against the gulls and cormorants that could foul the stonework and block vital water channels. Neglecting this seemingly minor chore for even a few days could have disastrous consequences. A drain clogged with nesting material would cause rainwater to pool on the upper levels. This standing water would inevitably find its way into the masonry, seeping deep into the joints between the massive stone blocks. In winter, this trapped moisture would freeze, expanding with immense force and cracking the very bones of the tower from within. The afternoon routine was typically one of quiet observation, scanning the horizon for the familiar sails of returning merchant fleets. But on this day, the keeper's vigil is interrupted by an unusual sight. Far out, a single vessel is visible, sitting dangerously low in the water. A thin, dark plume of smoke trails behind it, a clear sign of a fire aboard. The ship is in distress. The keeper moves with practiced urgency to the heliograph, a large, highly polished bronze shield mounted on a swivel. Tilting the shield to catch the afternoon sun, they begin flashing a coded signal toward the distant port authority on the mainland. The sequence of long and short flashes communicates the essential information. A ship is in peril, its bearing from the lighthouse, and its estimated distance from shore. In that moment, the keeper's role transforms from passive guardian to active participant in a life-or-death struggle. A surge of adrenaline and profound purpose sharpens their focus. They are no longer just a tender of a light, but the first critical link in a chain of rescue. With the signal sent, they can only watch and wait, their eyes fixed on the harbour until the sleek form of a fast rescue galley emerges, oars digging into the water as it speeds toward the stricken vessel. This duty was not merely a matter of conscience, it was often codified in ancient maritime law. Precedents like the Rhodian Sea Law established a framework of mutual obligation on the water, compelling vessels to render aid to others in distress. The lighthouse, with its commanding view of the sea lanes, became the designated eye of this system, its keeper the official sentinel responsible for initiating the response. The ability to spot and signal trouble so quickly did more than just save the lives of sailors. It also protected valuable cargo and the ships themselves. A timely intervention could mean the difference between dousing a fire and losing an entire vessel laden with grain, wine, or precious metals. This rescue function vastly increased the lighthouse's economic importance, justifying its immense construction and maintenance costs to the state and its merchant patrons. As night falls, the routine changes. In a lighthouse fueled not by a great timber fire but by oil, the atmosphere in the lantern room is different. It is quieter, cleaner, and filled with the scent of burning olive oil or bitumen. The work is less physically demanding than hauling logs, but it carries its own unique and terrifying risks. Here the keeper tends not to a single bonfire but to a series of large wicks set in a broad, shallow pool of fuel. Every hour they must meticulously trim the carbonized ends of the wicks to ensure a bright, smokeless flame. Using a small ladle, they top up the reservoir from heavy clay amphorae that were hoisted to the top of the tower that morning, a delicate and repetitive task performed in the flickering light. The greatest danger in this seemingly controlled environment was a flash fire. A moment of carelessness, a foot slipping on the polished stone floor while carrying a heavy, oil-filled amphora, could lead to instant catastrophe. If the vessel shattered, the flammable liquid would spread rapidly across the lantern room floor, its tendrils seeking the open flames of the lamp. The resulting inferno would be explosive, turning the confined space into a furnace within seconds, shattering the priceless glass or polished obsidian of the optics and melting the bronze fittings. For the keeper trapped inside, there would be no escape. Beyond the physical dangers, the most insidious threat was to the keeper's own mind. After months of profound solitude, the senses could begin to betray them. The constant low moan of the wind funneling through the tower's narrow windows might slowly start to sound like distant, mournful voices. This psychological strain was a constant battle. The keeper had to learn to distrust their own ears, to distinguish between the shriek of the wind and a genuine cry for help from a shipwreck foundering in the darkness below. A keeper's sanity was not a luxury. It was the most essential tool they possessed for the effective operation of the light and the preservation of life. The keeper knew that a single moment of failure, a single night of darkness, could spell doom for dozens, if not hundreds of souls. The great trading vessels, laden with grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, or precious silks from the East, navigated by his light. So too did the humble fishing boats, whose crews depended on a safe return to feed their families. Each ship was a fragile world of its own, a wooden shell carrying sailors, merchants, soldiers, and sometimes even families. They placed their absolute faith in that distant, man-made star, believing it would guide them past the treacherous reefs and shifting sandbars that lay hidden just beneath the churning surface of the sea. This was the immense weight the keeper carried with every bucket of oil, every polished reflector. It was a burden of trust, a silent contract with every vessel that sailed into his view. The lives of strangers were literally in his hands, tethered to the steadfastness of his flame. And so his focus always returned to that flame. It was the heart of the tower, the living entity he served. It was a demanding master requiring constant, meticulous care. The work was never truly finished. It was a cycle that renewed itself with every setting sun. Tending the fire was an art as much as a science. The quality of the light depended entirely on the keeper's skill. He had to read the flame's behavior like a scholar reads a text, understanding its flickers and colors, knowing when it was burning too high and wasting precious fuel, or too low and risking extinguishment. Throughout the night, he would periodically trim the wicks. This was a delicate operation, requiring a steady hand. Using a long-handled tool, he would carefully snip away the charred, carbonized ends. Too little, and the flame would remain smoky and dim. Too much, and it could sputter and die. Equally important was the cleaning of the optics. Soot and oil residue would quickly accumulate on the great bronze mirrors or polished obsidian sheets behind the lamp, dulling their reflective power. Every few hours the keeper would painstakingly wipe them down with soft cloths, ensuring every possible ray of light was captured and projected out into the darkness. A poorly tended flame was a treacherous one. If the wicks were not trimmed correctly, the fire would produce thick black smoke. This smoke would not only obscure the light, creating a hazy, weak beacon, but it would also coat the interior of the lantern room in a greasy film, making the air acrid and difficult to breathe. A smoky flame also consumed oil inefficiently, a critical concern when supplies could be delayed for weeks by bad weather. Worse still was the risk of the flame simply going out. A sudden draft from an improperly sealed window or a wick trimmed too aggressively could plunge the tower into darkness, a catastrophic failure in the dead of night. The consequences of such a failure were absolute. A darkened lighthouse was more dangerous than no lighthouse at all, for it created a false promise of safety. A captain, expecting a light at a certain point on his chart, might steer his ship directly into the rocks, believing he was still miles from shore. This crushing responsibility, combined with the profound isolation, could wear down even the strongest spirit. The keeper was a man set apart, living on the very edge of the known world. His only companions were the gulls, the wind, and the endless, indifferent sea. The silence between storms could be as deafening as the gales themselves. In this deep solitude, the mind could become a treacherous landscape. The keeper might start talking to himself, not just for company, but to hear the sound of a human voice. He might develop strange rituals and superstitions, small anchors to tether his sanity to the predictable world of his duties. A keeper who succumbed to this psychological pressure became the ultimate liability. If he grew too fearful to ascend the stairs during a storm, or too lost in delusion to properly tend the flame, the lighthouse would fail. In this lonely outpost, the keeper's mental fortitude was the final and most critical line of defense for every mariner at sea. The consequences of a lapse in duty were not always as dramatic as a completely extinguished flame. A poorly trimmed wick could produce thick black smoke, coating the inside of the lantern's glass panes with a layer of soot. This greasy film could dim the powerful beam to a faint glimmer, drastically reducing its range. A ship navigating by this weakened light might misjudge its distance to the coast by miles. In this way, a keeper's small momentary neglect in a simple task could be just as fatal as a catastrophic failure of the entire system. This relentless pressure was amplified by the profound temporal dislocation of the keeper's life. Days and weeks would merge into a single, continuous cycle of chores, distinguished only by the weather. News from the mainland, delivered by supply ships, was often months out of date, speaking of events and people that had long since moved on. The keeper existed in a bubble, a world apart, tasked with protecting a society from which he was almost completely severed. He was a ghost, watching the world of the living pass by on distant sails. To endure, many keepers developed a deep, almost spiritual connection to their immediate environment. They became experts on the tides, the habits of seabirds, and the subtle signs that foretold a coming storm. The lighthouse and its small patch of rock became their entire universe, a world they could understand and, to some extent, control. This intense focus on the natural world was a vital coping mechanism, a way to fill the immense silence with observation and purpose, turning the prison of isolation into a kingdom of one. Yet this adaptation came at a cost. When a keeper's term of service ended and he returned to the mainland, the world he had left behind could feel alien and hostile. The constant noise of a village, the press of a crowd, the dizzying pace of daily life, it could be an overwhelming sensory assault. Monastery of observation. This personal, isolated world stood in stark contrast to the lighthouse's grand purpose on the world stage. The network of beacons was more than a collection of navigational aids. It was an instrument of state power and geopolitical strategy. For great empires, controlling the sea lanes was paramount, and lighthouses were the fixed points on which this control was anchored, projecting imperial authority far beyond the shoreline. The Roman Empire, in particular, understood this system intimately. They established a sophisticated chain of lighthouses stretching from the port of Ostia to the coasts of Spain and the distant shores of Britain. This maritime infrastructure created secure, reliable shipping lanes, not just for merchants carrying grain and wine, but for the transport of legions and military supplies, effectively paving the seas for the expansion and maintenance of the empire. Because of this strategic value, a major lighthouse was a prime military target. For a rival power intent on disrupting trade or mounting an invasion, the first move in a naval campaign might be a swift raid to destroy an enemy's key beacon. To extinguish the light was to blind the port, sowing chaos and leaving the coastline vulnerable in the critical hours before an assault. Yet the greatest threats were not always from enemy ships. One afternoon, the keeper's routine is shattered not by wind or rain, but by a deep, violent tremor that runs through the stone. The colossal tower, designed to withstand any storm, groans and sways as the very rock beneath it shifts. This is a force of nature beyond any preparation, a challenge for which no procedure exists. Minutes after the shaking stops, the keeper, looking out from the high gallery, witnesses an impossible sight. The sea is not rising, but rapidly pulling away from the shore, exposing the seabed for hundreds of meters. From this unique vantage point, they are one of the few to see the phenomenon for what it is. The terrifying prelude to a massive wave, a harbinger of immense destruction. The keeper is safe, high above the reach of the coming water, but is transformed into a helpless witness. They can only watch as the tsunami engulfs the port and the city below, sweeping away ships, buildings, and lives in a single devastating surge. In that moment, the keeper feels an overwhelming impotence, their powerful beacon utterly useless against the raw power of the earth. Even these cataclysmic events, which could erase a lighthouse from existence, could not erase the idea behind it. Though many of the great ancient towers eventually fell into ruin, their fundamental principles and the technologies they embodied were not lost to history. Their legacy endured, forming the bedrock of maritime navigation for millennia to come. The core concept, a tall, resilient structure holding a powerful, elevated light, became the universal blueprint for all subsequent lighthouses. The engineering and architectural solutions developed by Greek and Roman builders in particular were studied, copied, and adapted throughout the medieval world, ensuring the continuity of this essential technology. This legacy extended beyond stone and mortar. The institutional knowledge of the keepers themselves, their meticulous routines, their specialized craft, their unyielding sense of duty was passed down through generations. This body of practical wisdom formed the basis for the professionalized lighthouse services of later centuries, and the solitary, vigilant keeper became an enduring archetype of maritime lore. After the hard labor of extinguishing the fire, cleaning the lantern, and hoisting the next night's fuel, the keeper descends to their Spartan living quarters. Here, a small, humanizing ritual unfolds. They prepare a simple breakfast of hard cheese, olives, and coarse flatbread, a meal that has likely been the same for months, drawn from their carefully rationed supplies. This quiet, solitary meal is more than just sustenance. It is a moment of profound peace and reflection. It is a small anchor of normalcy in an extraordinary and isolated life, a brief, silent respite from the immense responsibility of the light and the vast emptiness of the sea before the long, watchful hours of the afternoon begin. But the system was not only vulnerable to the forces of nature or the attacks of enemies. The most insidious and dangerous point of failure was far more subtle, residing within the keeper themselves. For all the robust engineering of the tower, its effectiveness ultimately depended on the unwavering consciousness of a single human being. We now turn to the consequences of a keeper, exhausted and alone, succumbing to sleep while on watch. The psychological toll of a severe storm was immense, a form of torture that could last for days. The constant, deafening roar of the wind and the percussive slam of waves against the stone created a sensory overload that frayed the nerves. The entire tower would vibrate, a deep, resonant tremor that traveled from the foundation stones up through the keeper's own bones, a constant reminder of the titanic forces trying to tear their world apart. It was in these moments that exhaustion became a mortal enemy, and the temptation to close one's eyes just for a second became almost irresistible. The true fear was not always of a catastrophic collapse, but of a more insidious failure from within. The keeper feared their own mind giving way under the strain, of succumbing to a moment of weakness that would extinguish the light and doom the very people they were sworn to protect. Surviving a storm was as much a battle of mental fortitude as it was a testament to the tower's engineering. Yet these structures were triumphs of ancient technology, their design and function representing a crucial leap in humanity's relationship with the sea. The very existence of a lighthouse was a declaration of intent that darkness and weather would no longer hold absolute dominion over maritime travel. The keeper, isolated and besieged, was the human component of a revolutionary system, a system whose principles would echo for millennia. This technological legacy was built on a foundation of core concepts that are still recognizable today. The first was elevation, the simple, powerful idea that height conquers distance. The second was the amplification and projection of light, moving beyond a simple bonfire to a managed, directed flame. These ancient towers were the prototypes from which all modern navigational aids would eventually evolve. The architecture itself was a key innovation. Builders learned to construct round or octagonal towers that presented less resistance to the wind. They employed massive interlocking stones at the base to create an unshakable foundation and designed internal spiral staircases that added to the structural integrity of the column. These were not just tall buildings, they were carefully engineered instruments designed to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. Within the lantern room, another critical evolution was taking place. Keepers discovered that a large, curved shield of polished bronze or silver, placed strategically behind the fire, could capture stray light and focus it into a more powerful directional beam. This rudimentary reflector was a monumental innovation, multiplying the effectiveness of the fire and casting its warning signal much farther out to sea. The cumulative effect of these advancements was profound. Shipping lanes that were once perilous passages became safer, more predictable conduits for trade and communication. Fleets could travel with greater confidence, and port cities could thrive on the reliable flow of goods. The lighthouse was an engine of economic growth, enabling the expansion of empires and the weaving together of disparate cultures across the water. This legacy wasn't just about preventing shipwrecks, it was about building the interconnected world we now know. Every vessel that safely reached its destination, laden with grain, wine, marble, or scrolls, did so under the watchful eye of a system conceived in antiquity. The light was a beacon of progress as much as a beacon of safety. But the grand sweep of history was far from the keeper's mind during the quiet hours of the morning. After the storm passed, or on any calm day, the focus returned to the small, essential tasks that made the entire enterprise possible. The great machine of the lighthouse depended entirely on the keeper's meticulous daily maintenance. The most crucial of these morning tasks was the care of the reflective surfaces. Using a paste made from fine ash and oil, the keeper would spend hours painstakingly polishing the great bronze or silver mirror. Every speck of salt spray, every film of soot from the previous night's fire had to be removed. It was a slow, repetitive, and physically demanding job. The keeper would work in a circular motion, feeling the smooth, cool metal under their cloth, watching as the dull surface slowly gave way to a brilliant, almost liquid shine. Their own reflection would emerge, distorted in the concave curve, a solitary face responsible for the power of the coming night's light. The quality of this polish directly translated into miles of visibility at sea. This intimate daily communion with the mechanics of the lighthouse forged a unique bond. The keeper learned the tower's language, the groan of the stones as they settled, the whistle of the wind through a particular joint, the specific resonance of the metal reflector as it was polished. The structure was not merely a place of work, it was a partner in a shared vital purpose. This relentless routine was also a powerful defense against the psychological perils of isolation. The structured nature of the work, stoking, cleaning, polishing, hoisting, provided a rhythm to the day, a predictable sequence of duties that anchored the mind and kept despair at bay. Each completed task was a small victory against the vast, empty expanse of the sea and sky. Yet for all the keeper's diligence and the tower's resilience, the system possessed a critical vulnerability that lay far beyond the stone walls. The entire operation, a lonely outpost of civilization, was tethered to the mainland by a fragile and often unreliable supply line. The keeper's survival, and therefore the continued burning of the light, depended entirely on the timely arrival of a supply boat. This vessel carried not just food and fresh water, but the essential fuel for the fire, the wood, the coal, or the precious oil. A delay of even a few days could spell disaster, introducing a threat that no amount of personal fortitude could overcome. Violent storms, the most common and terrifying adversary, could isolate the tower for weeks on end. Waves would crash against the stone with the force of a battering ram, making any approach by boat impossible. During these sieges of nature, the keeper would watch their fuel supply dwindle with mounting dread. Every log added to the fire, every measure of oil poured, was a step closer to the ultimate failure, a failure that was entirely out of their hands. The meticulous polishing and cleaning seemed a bitter mockery when the very lifeblood of the light was bleeding away. When the supply line failed, the keeper faced an agonizing choice that pitted their duty against their own survival. The protocol was absolute: the light must burn. But what happened when the last of the lamp oil had to be conserved, or when the final sack of coal was nearly empty? A keeper might be forced to burn their own furniture, their bedding, or any other combustible material within the tower, sacrificing personal comfort and warmth for the sake of the flame. This was the point where personal resilience met systemic collapse. The keeper was the final, desperate failsafe for a broken chain of logistics. The darkest hour, both literally and figuratively, was when these desperate measures were exhausted and the light finally went out. The fire, untended for 2 critical hours, dwindles from a roaring beacon to a faint, sullen glow. Its light no longer projects across the sea, no longer pierces the coastal haze. A grain fleet, having timed its final approach to Alexandria to coincide with the beacon's guidance, sails onward into the darkness, utterly blind to the dangers lurking just beneath the water's surface. The lead ship strikes a submerged reef with a sickening crunch of splintering timber. The sound, a low boom followed by a cascade of tearing wood, carries faintly across the water to the tower, jolting the keeper from their exhausted slumber. They rush to the lantern room, frantically stoking the embers and adding fuel, but it is far too late. The damage is already done. In the grey light of dawn, the keeper sees the full extent of their failure. The wreckage of 3 large merchant ships is strewn across the rocks, their hulls broken and their valuable cargo lost to the waves. They are consumed by a devastating, silent guilt, knowing that their brief human moment of weakness has cost dozens of lives and a fortune in grain. Such a catastrophic failure would trigger severe institutional consequences. The keeper would be summoned from their post by the harbour master's guard, their logbooks seized as evidence. An official inquiry would be held in the city, with testimony gathered from any surviving sailors, the captains of other vessels, and the keepers of nearby signal towers. The punishment for such profound dereliction of duty would have been absolute and harsh. The state, whose economic lifeblood and naval security depended on these beacons, could not tolerate incompetence or negligence in this critical role. The verdict would likely be imprisonment or even public execution, serving as a grim warning to every other keeper along the coast. To truly appreciate the ancient keeper's life, one must place it within the full context of its time. Their work was a unique and demanding intersection of heavy manual labor, specialized technical skill, and an immense solitary responsibility that had few parallels in the ancient world. The keeper was, in effect, a new kind of figure. They were not a farmer bound to the seasons of the land, not a soldier defined by loyalty to a legion, nor a priest serving the gods in a temple. They were a specialized technician whose daily rhythms and entire existence were governed by the needs of a colossal, intricate machine. Their very existence demonstrates the increasing complexity of the societies that built these structures. Operating a great lighthouse required a dedicated support system, a chain of command, a bureaucracy for pay and provisions, and a practical understanding of optics, engineering, and fuel management, all hallmarks of a sophisticated and highly organized state. Centuries pass. The great empires that built and maintained the lighthouses begin to fracture and recede. The Pharos itself, damaged by successive earthquakes and neglected by a weakened administration, starts to crumble. Its polished marble facade is stripped away, repurposed for new palaces and fortifications in a city that no longer commands the seas. The last keepers perform their duties with failing equipment and dwindling supplies. Their routines are no longer about perfect maintenance but a desperate struggle against entropy. They patch the crumbling masonry with their own hands, hoard scarce fuel, and tend a smaller, less effective fire in the ruins of the great lantern room. These final keepers are the lonely guardians of a dying legacy. They are tending a fading light, a flickering symbol of a past golden age of power and knowledge. They perform their duties with a profound sense of melancholy, knowing that one day soon the flame will be extinguished for the last time. When the great lighthouses of the ancient world finally went dark, the impact on maritime trade and travel was severe. The loss of these reliable long-range navigational aids marked the beginning of a kind of dark age for seafarers, fundamentally altering their relationship with the open ocean. Without the guiding beacons, night sailing in unfamiliar coastal waters became almost impossibly dangerous. Mariners were forced to revert to older, more uncertain methods of finding their way. They once again hugged the coastlines, a practice known as pilotage, relying on familiar landmarks that were invisible in darkness or fog. Celestial navigation using the stars to plot a course was a skill possessed by few and was useless under an overcast sky. The open sea, once a highway made safe by human ingenuity, reverted to a vast and treacherous wilderness. This retreat from the sea had profound consequences. Long-distance trade routes, the arteries of empire, became more perilous and less profitable. The flow of goods, ideas, and people between distant cultures slowed to a trickle. The interconnected world of the great ancient empires began to fragment as regions grew more isolated. The darkness that fell over the sea was a reflection of a wider intellectual and economic twilight descending upon the land. For the common sailor, this meant the return of a primal fear. The ocean was no longer a predictable space, mapped and illuminated by the keeper's steady hand. It was once again a realm of monsters, unpredictable storms, and the terrifying possibility of being dashed against an unseen shore. The guiding light, a symbol of humanity's power to tame the natural world, was gone, and the sea felt wild and unconquerable once more. The loss was more than practical, it was symbolic. The great lighthouses were monuments to reason, science, and civic ambition. They represented a belief in progress and a collective responsibility to protect those at sea. Their slow decay and eventual collapse mirrored the erosion of the very institutions and ideals that had built them, leaving behind a void that would not be filled for centuries. It is crucial to remember that the most famous lighthouses were not solitary wonders, but the crown jewels of a complex maritime infrastructure. They were the brightest nodes in a wider network of smaller coastal beacons, signal towers, and harbour lights. The keepers of the great towers were the masters of this system, their light serving as the primary reference point for all other navigational aids along a stretch of coast. This integrated system allowed for a level of coordination that is startlingly modern. A fleet approaching the coast could be guided sequentially from one beacon to the next, its arrival anticipated and prepared for. The lighthouse keeper was not just a janitor for a giant lamp, they were a critical component of state power, ensuring the safe passage of naval squadrons and the tariff-generating flow of merchant vessels. The very construction of these towers was a testament to human defiance against nature. They were erected on the most dangerous and exposed points of land, wind-swept headlands, low-lying sandbars, and even submerged reefs far from shore. The engineering required to lay foundations that could withstand the ceaseless battery of the waves was a monumental achievement in itself, a victory won before the first stone of the tower was even laid. The choice of materials was a science of resilience. Polished marble and decorative friezes were for the parts of the tower seen from land, but the core structure was all about durability. Hard granite blocks, meticulously cut to interlock perfectly, were bound with a mortar made from volcanic ash and lime, a formula that created a form of ancient waterproof concrete. The keeper's entire world was encased within this fortress of stone, designed to endure the worst the sea could offer. Part of the keeper's routine, therefore, involved the constant inspection and maintenance of this structure. They were not just lamplighters, they were masons and engineers. After every major storm, they would have to check every level of the tower for structural damage, looking for fine cracks in the masonry or signs that the immense force of the waves had shifted the foundations even slightly. This work was often perilous. To repair the sea-facing exterior, a keeper might have to be lowered hundreds of feet on a simple rope and pulley system, suspended between the wild sky and the churning water below. They would chip out crumbling mortar and press in fresh patches, all while being battered by wind and salt spray. This was a duty as vital as trimming the wick, for if the tower fell, the light would fall with it. Living inside such an immense and powerful structure must have profoundly shaped a keeper's psyche. The tower was both a sanctuary and a prison, a solid anchor in a world of chaotic motion. The constant, low-frequency rumble of the sea, transmitted through tons of solid rock, became the soundtrack to their existence, a permanent reminder of the forces they held at bay. From the lantern gallery at the apex of the tower, the keeper commanded a perspective few humans have ever known. They witnessed the world on a scale that was almost divine. They saw weather fronts forming on the distant horizon, watched entire fleets appear as mere specks and grow into mighty armadas, and observed the slow, inexorable turning of the constellations above the infinite blackness of the sea. This vantage point was the key to the lighthouse's revolutionary impact on navigation. It transformed the act of finding one's way from a desperate art of estimation into a more reliable science. The lighthouse provided a single, unmoving point of reference in a fluid and featureless environment, allowing mariners to plot their position with far greater accuracy. Before the lighthouses, a ship's captain at night was adrift in a three-dimensional puzzle of wind, current, and guesswork. The keeper's fire solved the most critical part of that puzzle. It was a declaration of certainty in an uncertain world, a single point of light that cut through the darkness and said with unwavering authority, "Here, here is the boundary between the sea and the land. Here is your safe harbor." The most immediate consequence of this newfound certainty was economic. The risk of night sailing was dramatically reduced, allowing ships to travel more directly and for longer periods. Cargo moved faster, insurance costs for voyages dropped, and trade volumes soared. The keeper, isolated in their tower, was a silent, indispensable engine of ancient commerce. This new navigational tool was not just an addition, it was a revolution. It complemented the ancient arts of celestial navigation and dead reckoning, providing a crucial anchor point when the stars were hidden or when a ship was too close to shore for guesswork. Mariners began to develop a new visual language, one where the identity of a coast was defined by the placement and character of its lights. The keeper's fire was the first letter in this new alphabet of the sea, allowing captains to read the shoreline in the dead of night and steer clear of its hidden dangers. The impact on the morale of sailors was just as significant as the impact on their charts. The sea at night was a place of deep-seated fear, a realm of monsters, myths, and the very real possibility of being dashed against unseen rocks. The distant, steady glow of a lighthouse was a powerful antidote to this terror. It was a human presence in the vast, indifferent wilderness of the ocean. It told a lonely watchman on a pitching deck that he was not alone, that civilization and safety were waiting just beyond the waves. Therefore, the keeper's role transcended that of a mere watchman. They were the linchpin in a system that fostered exploration, secured trade, and saved countless lives. Eastem of maritime trade, imperial communication, and collective safety. Yet this entire network, so vital to the ancient economy, depended not just on the keeper's diligence, but on the vast, often invisible, administrative structures that supported them from afar. For centuries, this institutional support was robust. Central authorities, whether Ptolemaic or Roman, understood the lighthouse as an essential state asset, ensuring funds for fuel, maintenance, and personnel. But as the political landscape of the late ancient world began to fracture, this centralized lifeline started to fray. The decay was a slow process of attrition, a delayed shipment of oil, a stonemason crew diverted to a military project, a salary that arrived months late. Each was a small failure in a weakening chain. The keepers, isolated at their posts, were the first to feel the effects, forced to improvise as the reliable order they depended on slowly dissolved. The fading of the great lights was therefore a direct consequence of this systemic breakdown. As the administrative will to maintain them vanished, so too did the navigational certainty they provided. The sea routes did not close overnight, but they became demonstrably more dangerous, contributing to the fragmentation of the interconnected Mediterranean world. Ultimately, the solitary keeper and their colossal tower were a reflection of the civilization they served. Their routine was an act of faith in a larger order, and their light was a projection of that order's power and confidence. When the hand of the state withdrew, the keeper's vigil could not continue, and the darkness that followed was a testament to how fragile such complex systems truly are. In the centuries that followed, the great towers met varied fates. Some were repurposed as military watchtowers or monastic retreats, their brilliant light replaced by a soldier's brazier or a hermit's prayer. Others were simply abandoned to the elements, their precision-cut stones plundered for new churches and fortifications, their bronze mirrors melted down. The keepers themselves or their descendants may have clung to their ancestral homes, their family's proud legacy of service fading into local folklore. The intricate knowledge of how to grind lenses, mix fuel, and maintain the complex machinery was lost, becoming as mysterious to subsequent generations as the forgotten gods to whom the first towers were once dedicated.